始め！
Oh, yes, 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 Legionaries. I have arrived with Sergeant Barnes in tow. We have inserted into Kinshasa, site of some of the most interesting battles, actually, of the Cold War. Little known facts, right? Like many of us, when we think about the Cold War, 1.0, I guess, we think about Vietnam. We think about Afghanistan, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, not the American one, right? That's a quite different thing. And we also think about the Korean War, etc. So, in effect, we think about East Asia, Central Asia, and so on. But most of us don't know that the majority of the Cold War was actually fought in Latin America and in Africa. Now you may be asking, why is it the case that we were fighting in this place? I mean, it seems to us an underdeveloped location, and the immediate benefits of such places are rather inconsequential on a geopolitical scale, at least at that time, or at least at the time of the 1950s, where the majority of the fruits of this era, or this region, primarily concentrated in resources like oil, rubber, agricultural products, etc. But it is only now that we're coming to really appreciate the true wealth, especially in the Congo and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. These locations, these countries, actually possess immense natural mineral wealth in the form of, uranium, heavy metals, diamonds, of course, gold, silver, platinum, and basically everything that makes modern technology tick, and all the economy around it actually interchange and basically connect with each other. Now, if you zoom forward, we blow past 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union, the breakup of the Soviet Union into its various different states, the immediate post-Soviet period where the Russian Federation is stabilizing itself, it's fighting wars of separation against various different, Caucasian, and I mean specifically from Circassia, right? So the Caucasian Mountains, right? This is the location between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And if you look that up on a map, it's basically this very limited region, but it has immense strategic importance to the Russian Federation. And the reason why is because the Chechen Republic, the site of which was the locus of two wars back to back, the First and Second Chechen War, as I have expounded in previous episodes and transmissions, was in effect the testing ground of modern liberal Russia. Well, obviously we can't really call it necessarily a liberal democracy or something like that. I think it's a little bit too far-fetched, but it's also something we can't call it, the Soviet Union. And if you listen to a bunch of boomers and retards, you'd think that 1991 never happened, that somehow these states are one and the same, and their strategic logic follow the same ideological course. Now, of course, you can always rebut me and say, well, geopolitical states, regardless of ideology, still pursue the same kind of geopolitical missions, which is power maximization, specifically for Russia, which is taking over specific territorial states, which secure the world island, right? And the world island is this concept where there are great bread baskets, right? One location is in North America, which is the prairie lands in Canada and the United States, and another one is basically a location that stretches between Ukraine all the way across into Kazakhstan and central Russia. These are the great grain basins, and in addition to all these things, there are great deposits of mineral resources which every modern geopolitical state requires to be self-sufficient. In the time between then and now, of course, technology has advanced, and with it, all the added requisites and inputs for industrial production and technological development. And what I mean by this is, of course, a much heavier emphasis on the recruitment of, let's say, minerals such as, for instance, zirconium, cobalt, aluminum, germanium, a number of different kind of obscure mineral deposits which are required for things such as your smartphone or chip production. Moreover, the innovation that these countries, these ex-Comintern countries, and Comintern, remember, is basically an association of states which are binded by their kind of Marxist international, Marxian ideological convictions, right? This is kind of the analog to the Free Society, the United Nations initially, and basically NATO nowadays. The idea is basically a confluence, a multi-dimensional alliance that is not merely military assurances and security agreements, but also economic agreements, diplomatic agreements, and the idea that one would act in concert with all the rest of the world and give mutual aid. In our time, and this is not totally fleshed out, but the current iteration of this is BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and I believe it was, South Africa. And, obviously there's a bunch of other states that are joining this organization in furtherance of the idea that basically it would deepen from what it is now, which is a petroleum kind of cartel, into a greater, wider military alliance. Of course, it's not fleshed out, as I had said before, and just to reiterate again, it's a purely economic but increasingly military and diplomatic alliance which is binding up parts of the world which had been previously communist, still others Islamist, and others kind of the third world, agglomerating onto the Russian Federation as the, let's say, faction leader for a kind of entente against, or a détente against, the NATO or Western powers. Now, if you remember and you brush up on your recent history, you remember that the 20th century is defined by its ideological conflicts, right? First, it was World War II, which was basically the main feature is the combined alliance of liberalism and communism against fascism. Of course, fascism lost, and then later liberalism versus communism, where communism lost, and now we live, or had lived until 10 years prior to this date of this transmission, in a unipolar world where it was the Francis Fukuyama end of history. It was a concept in which the triumph of liberal democracy has been proven to be the ultimate iteration of human organization, and that regardless of what happens in the aftermath of this event, humanity will be fundamentally defined by the liberal institutions as espoused by the Anglo-American alliance and ideology. Now, of course, this has been proven wrong. It is both rejected in countries outside of the Anglosphere, outside of NATO, but increasingly it's suffered a significant collapse in belief. Collapse in belief is this concept where basically every ideology, or rather every country, every nation, every body politic is bound up around a central ideology. It gives a central spiritual axiom around which we define our lives. I know that sounds kind of strange, but the reality is that it's so pervasive. You just can't see it because you're like fish in water. It has become part of your life. But these things are changeable, mutable, and they often evolve, right? Because even today, if you're an American or you live in the Anglosphere, the manner in which you engage with, let's say, capitalism or commerce is completely different from what it had been intended under people such as visionaries of classical economics like Adam Smith, or the Lockean philosophical kind of foil to this economic theory, which is, the rights of man and so on. And then later, of course, you have the liberal revolutions of the 1800s, etc. But I'm not here to pronounce on that. What I'm here to explain is the nature in which the ideological tether or central fiber is actually going to be the focus point of the coming conflicts of the 21st and 22nd century. I know it sounds far-fetched, right? But if you're able to remember from previous episodes where I talk about City and Man from Leo Strauss, we understand that the meaning and organizational principle of any body politic, any city-state, or any state at all, is its religion, right? And back in the day, before secular ideologies had come to the fore, we understood this as religion as such, as a kind of ideology spiritualized. But this is like capital R, right? But remember, for as much as we may, like atheists, Marxists, and so on, other kinds of secularists, like the rationalists, may claim that their ideology is completely secular, the nature in which they hold their ideology or their stated principles of belief and organizational principles and paradigms in which they organize themselves and the world around them and act in the world is itself a form of religion, right? And so in the West, the constituting religion is liberalism, right? Liberalism is this revolution that was the defining feature of the 18th century, right? So you have 1776 in America, which kicked off the, American liberal rights kind of rendition of liberalism. And then we have continental liberalism, which culminated in the French Revolution, and of course the terror and all that good stuff, Napoleon later, and was violently crushed. However, it turned out to be the most ascendant type of ideology. And later, we would come to understand that liberalism itself would not seep into various different countries, and when it did, even if it did, or influence those countries, it manifested in distinctly different ways. So in Germany, it was primarily a romantic movement, as opposed to a strictly rationalist one. In Russia, it was actually completely blotted out, and Austro-Hungary similarly had the same thing happen. Now, this is kind of abstruse detail, but the reason why I want to talk about this is because you can't understand the Cold War without understanding the ideological nature of the confrontation of that war. Further, you can't understand the coming conflicts of now and the way that war will be waged, which is principally, remember, war, as Clausewitz said, is a continuation of politics by other means, especially on a geopolitical level, right? And if American experience is anything to show or anything to kind of reference, Americans fundamentally do not understand how to engage the political via the modicum of war. Of course, we're very good at actually proselytizing and, let's say, effusing our cultural narratives, our cultural technology, but that's only done in the case where our client states are consolidated under our control, but are done so under circumstances where there's another big bad. So, for instance, the reason why Western Europe, or Europe as a whole today, is completely enraptured by American ideology is principally because of the fact that we won World War II, and the majority of Europeans thought that liberalism was at least a better alternative to communism. And, of course, there are many people in the West that thought the opposite, but this is the reason why so many of these liberal states, which had become captured by the American hegemonic elite in the form of clandestine economic and military supremacy throughout the West, and became true believers in themselves. That's why they became us, not because they were willing to become us, but because they did so out of a sense of, well, this is the this is the least worst out of two evils, right? The lesser of two evils. And it was a meaningful way of countering communism, which was seen as an existential threat by many Europeans. Of course, 1991 rolls around, and the Marxist-Leninist brand, right, what we consider to be Stalinist brand of communism failed. Mao itself, or Maoism in China and the PRC, also suffered a significant collapse in belief. Even though ostensibly the People's Republic of China is a Maoist, Marxist ideological state with Chinese characteristics, it is interesting to note that Xi Jinping, in the most recent, I think it was one of these councils, their mass councils, it was not simply the Chinese Communist Party assembly, but also that of the lower body, where he addressed the Chinese Communist Party and explained how leftist Maoist thought was a mistake. Now, this is significant because you have to understand, in that country, of course, they're bound by the ideology and they can't really stray outside of it. But de facto, what this means is a rejection of Maoism as such, and a return to a new equilibrium, or rather an old one, but also a new one which is socialistic as a ideological basis and foundation, but returns to a more civilizational appeal of Chinese civilization state. If you're familiar with Samuel P. Huntington, he talks about the future rise of civilizational states, in which the world is basically carved up into civilizational regions, and the content of which is basically entire biomes of cultural thought which are unique unto themselves in the way in which they engage with the world. And this may seem trivial to many people, especially those people who are so brainwashed by liberalism. They think that humans are interchangeable parts and that there is one fundamental, unique natural truth, but they completely obscure from their perception, their cognitive horizon, the possibility that people see the world differently. And when they see the world differently, they act in the world differently. And of course, there are natural elements in which we must all engage with that are common to us all, but the distinguishing factor are the mores, and the values that we hold most high are what make us distinct and exceptional. And the exceptional nature is what is the core principle of conflict. The deviations between each other, the confrontations and the rivalries between these various civilizational states and visions of the world ultimately are what's going to change and take the future. The most close thing we can think of that actually approaches what we're talking about is the medieval era. If you remember the Christian church, after I think it was 1148, where there's a great schism between the Orthodox and the Latin Church, right? So the papacy, the Catholic Church, and then of course the Eastern churches, which is the Orthodox Church, at that time spearheaded by the Byzantine Empire, which is of course the Roman Empire. And in the West, it was championed by the papacy, and later its more formal outer political core, the Holy Roman Empire. Now, they would vie for cultural hegemony over states in the Slavic region. So if you can think to yourself, okay, if you look at Europe and you look at Asia Minor, right, so where modern-day Turkey is, they were trying to conquer everything north of that region, not by, let's say, physical conquest, military conquest, or even political alignment, right? Because political alignment can be very mercenary. You don't necessarily have to align completely or even remotely ideologically to form a political alliance of convenience. What the Byzantine emperors, and for the sake of this transmission, I'm going to use Byzantine legionaries. I hope you understand. I know it's a great lèse majesté. I know the Basileus, let's say Alexios Komnenos would throw me in the dungeon, for calling him a Greek king. But anyway, I return to the point here. They were vying with the papacy for cultural hegemony over these converting pagan Slavic states, Slavic kingdoms. And so, for instance, in Bavaria, which is Bohemia, right, there's the Czechia of modern day. They were considering who should we align with. And the reason why the Czechs use a Latin alphabet is because they aligned ultimately with Latin Christianity, chose to convert to Latin Christianity, and ultimately, with it, all the intellectual, cultural content of the Latin Church, which was the West, is the West, into its country and became acculturated towards that pole. Now, conversely, if you remember specifically, like the Byzantine Empire went to the Bulgars, they converted them to Orthodox Christianity. This is where St. Basil is known, and St. Cyril. And it's important because, remember, Cyril is actually the one that went abroad and created an alphabet for the Slavic languages, which had previously had none or very primitive kind of glyphs that weren't enough or didn't actually bring the necessary intelligence to culturation necessary to actually connote biblical information. So what I mean is basically St. Cyril is the one that created the Cyrillic alphabet, and due to that fact, the Cyrillic alphabet is obviously a form of deviation or evolution from the Greek alphabet, right? And with it came not simply the theology and philosophy of the Greeks, but also everything else with it. The cultural mores, the understanding of the world, the spirituality that had been imbued from Greek Christendom had been fleshed out and kind of emanated from Byzantium into these Orthodox Slavic states. And not least consequential is the conversion of the Kievan Rus to Orthodox Christianity. The Kievan Rus, of course, are the forerunners of the modern Russian state. It is precisely Russian Orthodoxy met with a Slavic socio-biographical populace that gave rise to what is now known as the Rus, right? The Russians. And that entire cosmology and cultural paradigm with which they see the world. And the reason why it has salience, both of these religions have salience to this day, is because for as much as the revolutions of 1800s, the 1700s, made their mark in establishing a liberal secular state, ultimately it kind of fell flat. And the reason why is because I would suggest the following, is that man has a spiritual need, and that kind of spiritual satiety can only be brought through a spiritual ideology. It cannot be satisfied with base materialistic paradigms of the world. Rationalism simply does not evoke the same convictions in man. It doesn't inspire him. It doesn't actually have the same tether spiritually, or it doesn't galvanize the spirit outside of a very dedicated core of ideologists, right? And they're very small cadre. These are the kind of guys that are like Robespierre, or the people such as Rousseau and so on. And it's interesting to note that despite their rationalist beliefs, it was still underpinned by the idea of the divine. Of course, in turn, is influenced by the Latin Church, the theology of the Latin Church, and therefore the culture as it had bled down into their civilizational state. The same thing can be said about Orthodox Christianity, and these spheres are still made felt. They still have rifts within wider Europe and the world as distinct civilizational spheres. So, the way that I would like to explain why it is that communism and, let's say, liberalism, all these ideologies, why is it that they have no leg to stand on spiritually, they don't have staying power, is because they're so specific to its time frame and so limited in its scope and so simple and basic that it simply is just not capable of enthralling the human being in its image, right? This is why there's a resurgence of religion, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union, of not simply Christianity, but Islam. And of course, in the Far East, there's increasing inroads of Christianity in previously what is considered to be atheistic societies, such as the Han Chinese, which were specifically Confucian, and they have, of course, a number of different pagan slash almost spiritual religions like Buddhism and so on. But I think Buddhism is the only one that actually has any kind of religious, spiritual analog to these various religions that I had explained earlier, the Abrahamic religions, right? But Confucianism is fundamentally a kind of philosophy. And as we had seen with the ancient Greeks, philosophy in and of itself doesn't mean anything unless it's underpinned with a spiritual significance. Most famously, of course, Plato. Plato is a great philosopher. I mean, he is the philosopher. Everything is a footnote of Plato going forward. However, Plato only really took off, especially amongst the people, and made it a living philosophy when it had become spiritualized in the Philo-Judaic sect of, not the Philo-Judaic sect, but the Judeo-Hellenic sect of Messianic Judaism, which is what we call today Christianity. It is through Neoplatonism and the binding of Platonism with Christianity, this kind of spiritualized understanding of the world, that we get today the modern iteration of Christianity. So, why does this have salience to the conflicts that we have in our time? Well, if we remember, legionaries, the forms of warfare which had existed since the dawn of time, first, second, and third generation warfare. And just for the sake of brevity, and because life is short, let me just skip to the third one. Third generation warfare is what we consider to be conventional war. That conventional war is basically defined by World War II. It has limited propaganda content, but the majority of it is battle done on the battlefield. It is industrial warfare writ large, with mass armies and kind of an emphasis on conventional forces maneuvering and fighting enemy forces of given states. Ever since the fall of the Axis powers in 1945 and the rise of the bipodal world order, one defined by the Soviet Union, the other defined by the United States, we come to see the rivalry of ideology take the fore. And then, of course, we start to see wars of ideology proliferate throughout the world. I could get into the Cold War as such, but it would detract us from the main thrust of this commander's tent. And ultimately, what happened as a kind of sublimation of that war is that ideology turns out to be a very limited technology, and that spirituality has more staying power and informs more and acculturates more a people to a common metapolitical body politic than any ideology can in a meaningful way. And here's what I'm going to say the following is, so for instance, even during the Cold War, the United States of America would actually align with communists and socialist forces of a different mark to contradict or to bisect the enemy party line, right? To make itself amenable to the basically democratic elements of communism, who weren't so down with the dictatorship of the proletariat and Stalinism and that kind of flavor of things. So it was very mercenary in how it was employed, and ultimately this ideology lacks enough cultural meaning to propagate a people, right? Because I'm sure that you've experienced this in the West, but in the West, the collapse of religion itself has caused a kind of source of ennui. We have killed God, right, in the words of Nietzsche, in our own hearts as a people, as a civilization, and what has happened is we have fallen into this very basic and rudimentary ideology that makes everyone into an autonomous or atomic cipher of economic interplay. And that's the thing. No one is fighting for Walmart. No one's putting their life on the line for Walmart. No one's having kids and families for the sake of Walmart. They're doing so, they only do so with a sense of religious experience. And I will say this without any kind of shame or irony. Man needs religion, even if he doesn't even know he has religion. That religion needs to be something so powerful that it pushes the meat into the world, because man doesn't live for those basic things. He doesn't live for basic sustenance. He doesn't even live for basic economic plenty and decadence. Like, liberals actually thought that if we gave people a surplus, a bourgeois existence, where we gave everyone a surplus of material wealth, that man would feel good. But as it turns out, it doesn't. And as I have cited many times before, the rat utopia experiments have shown that, specifically rats, but mammals in general kind of echo this trend, where when we are exposed to a super abundant environment without any necessary effort to exert into our environment to accomplish those said resources, we become psychologically undone. Classically, we refer to this concept as decadence, but this is what's called societal sink, right? Social sink. And it is only now that we're coming to grips with the centrality of spirituality in the human physiognomy and sociological states of our various different communities. So that's a very long way of saying that the clashes of the future are going to be clashes not really of religion, but spiritual warfare. And that sounds so strange, because it is something that we think is of a bygone era, a feature of that's relegated to medieval, primitive, superstitious times. But that's not the case. Man fundamentally is an irrational being, and he lives in a state of religious intoxication. Now, if we're able to take another element of this new innovation in warfare, the nuclear era, right? And the dynamic of nuclear weapons poses one where strategic weapons, weapons become of strategic significance. And so you're not really able to wage peer wars directly, for fear, of course, of total nuclear disaster. And I don't know, there are many technologies that say, or many kind of reports that say that there are forms of nuclear war that can happen in which it doesn't turn the Earth into an irradiated hellhole, but it certainly kills the vast majority of people. Of course, this is an Armageddon. I wouldn't really want to wage it. I'm sure you wouldn't want to either. And so the imposition of this kind of check on peers, or at least nuclear-armed countries, comes to the fore as the central dynamic of diplomacy and geopolitical calculi rather. So much of the geopolitical decisions of our time and that of the Cold War had to do with the placement of said nukes, whether it be, ICBMs, IRBMs, whatever it is, intermediate, long range, whatever. And ultimately, the significance of this is what guides states to specific diplomatic accords, and specifically decides whether or not a conflict will continue or it will cease, and where it will cease. Korea is a great example of a frozen conflict, and it is increasingly, until recently, a phenomenon of our current era, where a war is waged, and it is basically, it settles down, and in the settling of down, it never really resolves itself. It kind of just stays as a frozen battle line across whatever disputed territory indefinitely. And it causes a constant need for military deployment and effusion of force. I believe this is a good thing. If you can see how this affects the political, cultural environment of South Korea, you start to see that people, generally speaking, have more of a patriotic and asabiya cohesion, like togetherness, that is imbued in them because of their military service, their shared military service. I believe it's an important thing. I myself hope that the United States and the rest of the West becomes a republic of Starship Troopers, but I get ahead of myself, legionaries. And so what has happened is, in addition to this nuclear triad type check on strategic, diplomatic, geopolitical actions, there is also the added element of the internet. Information has come to the fore as the leading element of effectively command and control, political control, and ultimately governing society control. It's also an element of economic function as well as regulation. So there is nothing more consequential than the internet revolution, the computer revolution of the 90s and the early 2000s. We're only starting to see, at least as a very marked and distinct progression, evolution of what that necessarily means through the utilization of the cybersphere for political and economic aims of different states. And finally, of course, now we have UAVs and UAS and the proliferation of UAS. I did previously a thread regarding the innovation of UAS and the marked influence it has on the previous generation of warfare. So, for instance, the Nagorno-Karabakh war, which was waged between the Azerbaijani forces and Armenia, Armenia was fundamentally a military patterned on Soviet military doctrine from the late 80s, 1980s, right? So mass armored warfare defined by deep battle, conventional arms with very little kind of innovation going on. And then the Azerbaijanis actually were patterned on a completely different and more modern doctrinal footing. They, of course, had the basic, right? They had the same elements of the 1980s, Soviet equipment with some Western technology and, armaments and munitions, and also they trained up their infantry and their base military to a higher Western standard. In addition to that, they also closely integrated UAS systems. And this has far-reaching effects, right? So it improves your overall combat effectiveness, it improves your situation awareness. I mean, you're able to basically see every moving piece, every element of the enemy force and your friendly forces, your dispositions, and the enemy disposition in real time in most weather climates, right? And it's a war that has also been used as a cornerstone for things to come, because I really painted a stark picture between these forces, but the Armenians also had UAVs here and there. It was the commercial UAVs that you're familiar with that you can buy at Walmart, but they didn't have the same kind of Reaper drones, let's say, mounted munitions, unmanned vehicles that were able to kind of semi out of the loop do their own patterned reconnaissance and attack missions and fire missions and so on. And so this war was won decisively in the Azerbaijanis' favor, despite the fact that the Armenians had the traditional, basically advantageous ground. They had emplaced concrete positions, they had motivated military setup points, they had good logistical lines, they had this, that, and the other thing, all prepared and ready, pre-sighted ranges, and so on. But they weren't prepared for the disorder and chaos and the Schwerpunkt, the ability for the Azerbaijani forces to have a greater situational awareness of the battlefield and therefore concentrate their forces at the decisive points. And of course, that would roll up the line. It would culminate in the Battle of Susa. But I'm not going to get into any more further detail here because I think it's important that you just read either the book or the short little thread that I have, and I'll pin it here in the transmission notes. But this is suffice to say that the elements of warfare have decisively changed. But the most important one is, of course, the political, and the way in which the political is gained in a war through different tactical means. Previously, it had been understood, if you are an American, and unfortunately this is a recurring error that we simply have not really overcome, but we believe that as Americans, that if we defeat all the enemy armed forces, that somehow we are able to subjugate this enemy polity to our will. Now, as we saw with Afghanistan, GWAT in general, the previous war with Vietnam, and so on, counterinsurgency is a very tricky business because it's not really counterinsurgency is not the right term. What you're trying to do is consolidate political control. But what is political control? At base, it is the elements or most important elements of a body politic to be consolidated or co-opted to your will, right? Subordinated and subjugated to your will. And the best way to do that, of course, you can't wipe out entire populations like you used to do before 1945. That's obviously a faux pas, and therefore you have to win hearts and minds. But you can't do that unless you're engaging with the people, basically the psychosociological network or intertwining of a culture and binding it to political outcomes that your state is seeking to achieve. And if we fast forward a little bit and we look at the Russian-Ukrainian war, we are understanding a different element as well, because it is a foregone conclusion that neither side is able to decisively impose a military outcome in a conventional sense. And so the emphasis, right, of basically deep operations, and this includes but is not limited to deep sabotage missions, political maneuverings, disinformation, information, kind of misinformation campaigns designed to either destroy the will to resist or to encourage the enemy populace over to your side, or at least to some kind of settled negotiation, right, through sustained pressure and information gathering slash formation, right? So that way the person who is perceiving through the internet the situation by proxy is given the impression that not only is it inevitable that the Russians are going to win, let's say if you're Ukrainian, but it is also in your to your advantage. And moreover, it's to your disadvantage that the evil Western powers are going to stab you in the back, and so on. That is the dynamic of hybrid warfare. So, now we come to the modern chessboard of the world. On one side, we have Russia, the PRC, Iran, and a number of different states aligned with this core. And on the other, we have NATO and Western-aligned nations. The most important campaigns being waged now are those that you don't really know about, the ones that are actually being fought in the bush of Nigeria, or on the coastal waters of Guinea-Bissau, or on the various locations or locales of the Horn of Africa, where the PRC is establishing a number of different naval installations and making their cultural slash economic presence felt. So, for instance, another dynamic of hybrid warfare is the endowments states give to client states. In Africa, for instance, it has been our cornerstone policy to effectively make our foreign aid, our institutional aid or military aid contingent on certain social ideological lines. So, for instance, one important one is Liberia. When there was a civil war, I mean, it's constantly in a state of flux, but Charles Taylor, if you remember him, American aid was contingent to him on the basis that he would not simply enfranchise women, but meaningfully scale back or legislate certain mandates which would advance the cause of feminism, advance Western values in his country, and acculturate it to the image of the United States. But conversely, and this is actually a distinct factor that Russia and the PRC have been leveraging, they're not interested in the social policies of any given state. In fact, they're not simply agnostic, they're self-conscious of who they are, and they understand that they're engaging with states which are reflections of a certain body politic and culture and civilization which have diverging mores and opinions. So it's a return to classical diplomacy, right? There's no imposition of an ideology upon another. And so what they do is when they engage with these states, they do so on the premise of immediate benefit and reward with shared political ends. So for many of the African states, it is increased military and financial infrastructure development that can be given by these countries in return for certain mining concessions, petroleum concessions, or in the case of the PRC, most notably, the lease or land lease of certain military installations which are sprawling. I mean, you should see how large these installations are. There's one in Argentina, I know it's not in Africa, but it's in Argentina, and it's just so big, it's actually the size of Delaware. And so this kind of diplomacy has an asymmetrical edge to American/Western diplomacy, because Western states are beholden to certain antiquated liberal values which hamstring it from effectively engaging with diplomatic consolidation, or rather state consolidation, aligning these states to our interests, right? And so, for instance, there's a lot of talk in the news about Venezuela. There's a lot of talk in the news about states like South Africa, and so on. And if it were up to the Western states, a lot of these states would be pariah states. They would have no kind of external communication, economic trade, or military technological exchange, or even, for instance, like military training, and so on. But the reason why Maduro is able to actually consolidate his political control over Venezuela, which is in dire straits, is because Russia is relatively agnostic, and it will do business with any given state so long as it is aligned diplomatically and, I guess, in a kind of on détente against the West, and advances Russian interests in hard terms. And moreover, and unless you live under a rock, you have probably become acquainted with the individual named Dugin. And it's interesting to me because this is an element of the soft power projection, the thesis that is still being expounded and fleshed out and masticated by this faction, generally speaking, and exactly how it is that you're going to project yourself, because this is soft power, right? And we already did a transmission regarding what is soft versus hard power, and effectively cultural norms, the cultural superstructure. It is the very sediment, it's almost like the glue that consolidates and legitimizes your political control. And so Dugin is effectively working on whatever his political theory is. I'm not personally a fan or anything. I'm just kind of making this point as a salient element of this hybrid warfare theory that I'm going to talk to you about and define it in its totality. Okay, so basically Dugin is just is talking about an ideology in which civilization states are respected, and a kind of return to the civilization elements and acculturation of humanity, and it's made so that way it's in juxtaposition with the inhuman and completely like a completely rational element of liberalism, which, as we see today, is a complete mistake and a spiritual acid that has been poured all over the West, all over the world, and is causing massive societal problems from within. I mean, literally tanking, our fertility rate is tanking our mental health, our physical health in real terms. I mean, it's causing us to act erratically and to make decisions economically, politically, that are not in our self-interest or the interests of our progeny and so on. Anyway, all this is to say, all of this combined, the effusion of Russian power, projection of Russian power, is what is called effectively hybrid warfare theory. And Russia has the edge on this because Russia understands that the wars of the future will not be waged merely on the battlefield, but it will be waged in cyberspace, in space itself, in the seas, in the minds of people, in the hearts of people, most importantly. And all of this is going to happen in tandem with one another. It's not going to happen in isolation, but rather as one cohesive whole, as part of one concerted strategy. And this is the trouble with the United States for two different reasons. The first one is the limitations of liberal democracy, or liberalism as a whole. Liberalism supposes a negative freedom in which we are all able to believe whatever we want and do whatever we want, so long as we hold certain social norms. And those social norms, of course, are incredibly caustic, but atomic individualism, a complete separation from the natural with the rational. So basically, you are a uniform, universal cog, and the reason why we're able to assimilate anyone to the United States is because, you're no different from any American. Anyone can be an American, and we were finding out that, like, very acutely, how wrong that is. And so Russia is exploiting this because they understand the reality of sociology, psychology, the economic sphere, and the military sphere. This is something that the PRC has actually been expounding or kind of using as a doctrine to counter the West's power, which has overwhelming military superiority, but it has a weakness when it comes to the economic sector, which they're able to asymmetrically dominate because of our brain aids when it comes to free trade, which again is an emanation of liberal values and mores. And so anyway, without further ado, let me just go ahead and read from an article from ISW, right? And they talk about the Russian hybrid war theory and the significance of conventional and the kind of orchestra of all these elements which will bring together all the powers that culminate into a body politic or are part of the body politic, and how to leverage it into one cohesive effort towards state power projection. And so without further ado, I'll read from the article here. And here we go. The Russians define hybrid war precisely and coherently as a type of war rather than a set of means to conduct state policy. The U.S. discussion of hybrid war overly focuses on the means short of conventional forces and conflict that the Russians have most famously used. The Russian soldiers without insignia, little green men, who helped seize Crimea in 2014, and the proxies Russia uses in eastern Ukraine are most often the focus of Western assessments about how to respond to Russian hybrid war. Russian conception of hybrid war is more expansive. It covers the entire competition space, including subversive, economic, information, and diplomatic means, as well as the use of military force extending above the upper threshold of the gray zone, concept that accurately captures the Chinese approach to war. The Kremlin considers conflicts including Belarus, Ukraine, Syria, Libya, and Venezuela to be hybrid wars. The Russian armed forces openly discuss several ongoing conflicts as hybrid wars. The Kremlin actively refining and utilizing its theory of hybrid war in Europe and around the world. It uses a blend of means and instruments, including conventional military forces. Russian Air Force aircraft in Syria constitute its most important means of influencing that conflict, although it has also deployed Russian Army, military police, and special forces troops as well. Russian hybrid war efforts in Belarusia include sending 3 battalion tactical groups from Russian Airborne Force divisions to exercise there, along with Tu-160 nuclear-capable bombers. Russia's engagement in Libya, by contrast, has been primarily through a private military company, which is also operating in Syria. The Kremlin adjusts the kinds of forces it commits to hybrid conflicts according to the assessment of the conflict's requirements. The Kremlin does not shy away from sending and using units from its conventional military forces just because it has defined the war as hybrid. So basically a proxy war. It's a subkinetic, official war, right? Continuing. Russia sees hybrid wars as the main line of future military development, rather than a temporary phenomenon. The Russian military maintains theoretical space for the idea of a traditional conventional war and does not assert that all conflicts are now inherently hybrid. It instead argues that conventional war is a legacy type of conflict that is increasingly unlikely in the 21st century due to technological changes and strategic power balances. Like I said, the nuclear power check and the diminishing returns when it comes to actual head-on conventional exchanges. Returning. The Kremlin further asserts that Russia should shape its military and national security tools to optimize for hybrid wars, not only because they're increasingly common, but also because they are now more practical and effective than traditional conventional warfare. And here's the most important part of the article, and I'll leave it off on this, and we're going to parse it out in detail and just discuss it so that way we can masticate it fully in our cognitive craw. Returning. The Russian military is therefore adapting to improve its capabilities to conduct hybrid wars. The Russian military is not attempting to hide its intent to conduct offensive hybrid wars. Russian military theorists write extensively and openly on general strategies and doctrine for offensive hybrid wars and additionally discuss the development of individual hybrid means. The Kremlin's ongoing adaptations include efforts to 1. Centralize all potential Russian decision-making bodies, civilian, military, media, and economic, to coordinate whole-of-government efforts. 2. Adapt traditional military theories and doctrine to enable the Russian military to conduct hybrid wars as a core mission. 3. Conduct society-wide information campaigns to improve patriotic consciousness, which the Kremlin assesses is essential in hybrid war. 4. Increase the ability and strength of Russian information campaigns to successfully conduct hybrid wars over many years. 5. Improve the conventional expeditionary capabilities of the Russian armed forces to enhance their capability to deploy abroad in support of hybrid wars. 6. Improve the Kremlin's ability to employ PMCs and other supposedly deniable proxy forces. And finally, 7. Subordinate kinetic operations to information operations. So let me say it again. Subordinate kinetic operations to information operations, which the Kremlin assesses is the ongoing foundational change in the character of war, in planning processes and execution. So in other words, the primacy of information war. Information war. And so, pause. This is the element, this is the future, this is the hybrid quality of the conflicts of the future. And ultimately, it is something that is characteristic of the great game, in which there's a constant level of low-level conflicts being conducted all across the world, constantly. And it's not always kinetic, it can always be subkinetic, and what I mean by that is, of course, combat and so on. But it's always in a constant state of undeclared war. And the Russo-Ukraine war might be a theater, but it's being waged simultaneously along all axes of approach in different places. And the major shortcomings of the United States defense policy is also the fact that the government is not able to regiment and subordinate all the arms of the federal government into one concerted long-term vision effort. And that's the trouble, because the Russians are able to do that, and they're able to assess, based on the campaign and circumstance in which they find themselves, which tool is right for which situation. Here there's war, there's police activity, over there are, assassinations. Still over in different places there are PMC type situations going on, clandestine operations, and so on. And all of this is happening in confluence with the information cyber element, which pervades through all the different modes of war and elements of war which characterize this hybrid war theory. Alright, Legionaries, with all this taken into account, it doesn't matter if you understood anything that I said. What you should take away from this new innovation in warfare is the primacy of unity of action by a state actor, right? By a political state actor. And ultimately, the shortcomings we find ourselves in, rather the asymmetries that Russia, PRC, and so on are able to leverage against us, is a function of the fact that they are engaged in a total state effort. Whereas in the United States, in the larger West, by merit of, let's say, our liberal ideology and convictions of this current time, we believe that the organs of the state and the citizens of that state are separate entities, that the citizen body is basically non-combatant and therefore a non-formulaic aspect to the overall state effort to engage in, whether it's economic rivalry and warfare, intelligence efforts, and so on. That is the element of the future. The future is, much as World War II was, and the Cold War was, a state of total war and total enmity. My concerns that I have for the United States is that it has a lack of unity of political principle. So what I mean to say is, as you know, in democracy we elect our representatives, and those representatives have a turnover which are quote-unquote answerable to the people. Of course, you and I both know that it's somewhat of a farce. So much of the media is controlled by not simply our clandestine services or those allied with us, but also private actors and foreign agents. In addition to everything else, the banking system, the various systems of control, even within the government, there's a disunity of parallel agencies. We have innumerable numbers of agencies with one particular task set, and they often overlap and conflict with each other. It's very difficult to actually have cross-branch cooperation. Jurisdiction is always a nightmare, especially when it comes to domestic counterintelligence and counterinsurgency efforts. Obviously, this is something that the state, the American state, right? And when I say state, you have to understand state in the small s sense. I'm not talking about the provinces, the various provinces of the United States. I'm talking about specifically the concept of the government, which isn't correct, right? Because in political science, the government is the incumbent regime, which are made of people. The state is the fixture, which is basically the structure that governments inhabit or leave with the turn of regimes. Now, I don't believe in simply leveling criticism. I'm not here to spread defeatism. In fact, I'm here to offer answers and solutions to those who will listen. I think it's important to understand one more thing when it comes to ideology, the interplay of ideology and the civilizational state with the various technical functions of warfare and state rivalry. You have to understand that the technical means are simply that, means. Whereas the ends of these various whether it's government agencies, whether it's the military, whether it's civil service, whatever it may be, these things are aimed, ideally, to propagate the overall Zeit, right? The idea of the nation. And I think it's worthwhile mentioning this guy, Ernst Nolte. He's a German historian who spoke of basically the phenomenology of history and nations, and what is it that animates them to act in one way or another, okay? And so ultimately, the reason why, nations do things, for as much as there are great men of history who have some semblance of positive control over the functions of state, all of these people are usually united in a general Zeit, even if they are of disparate factions that are enemies of each other. They all function within the same paradigm. So for instance, even in the United States, we all function within the classical liberal framework of, I would argue otherwise, but I think just for the sake of brevity, 1776, right? We're functioning under the premise that our legitimacy stems from the originating idea of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, every man is created equal under the eyes of God, and so on and so forth. This is an extremely antiquated understanding of humanity. This is back in the day when, Adam Smith was still writing about economics, classical economics. This is back in the day when the rights of man had a lot of implicit understandings and ideas which would be abhorrent to the average American citizen today. I don't want to elucidate what exact details that necessarily means, because I feel like this is something that the enemy will jam my transmissions for. However, suffice it to say the following, that the spirit, the essence of a nation has very little to do with any one crystallized form. In the case of, let's say, even Germany, no, let's do France. France is still one cogent entity through its various revolutions. Right now it's on its fifth republic, but it was France all the way through, right? It was France when it was a kingdom. It was France when it was the Directory under Robespierre. It was France under Napoleon. It was France then again under the Second Republic. And the Restoration. This is actually Charles X took power, and then it was France once again under the Second Republic with Louis Philippe, and then it was France under the Third, and then with Napoleon III coming to power, the Second French Empire, and so on, all the way to present day Fifth Republic. Now, every iteration of France is a specific crystallized form. A form which responds to two things, right? The providential evolution of a people and the technical evolution of a people. So one is spiritual, idealistic, an evolution of the idea, and one is a response to the physical landscape of the day-to-day citizen body politics experience. So, the America of today is very different from the America of the 1700s for very practical reasons. And I don't just mean necessarily reducing it to technology, but I even mean social organization. Today we have become so utterly egalitarian. If you were able to transport somehow one of the founding fathers to the present day, he would think that we were living in the French Directory or the Commune of France. Right? He's like, well, what is this? And what's worse is, of course, there are many different forms of the American government or the American state, right? Because remember, we first had the Articles of Confederation, which then was supplanted by the Constitution as we know it, and then we had the iteration after the American Civil War, and then again under FDR, and then still more under the Great Society and the Marxist Revolution of 1965. We have been living under the premise, or rather the paradigm, of post-World War II America, this form, for a very long time. Now, At the time of World War II, we were actually a totally mobilized nation in the sense that we were a totalitarian nation, as much as you may not understand or feel of it that way, because ostensibly we were fighting for freedom, ostensibly we were fighting for X, Y, or Z ideals, but in practice, the surveillance state, the total mechanization, regimentation of society, down to rationing and basically popular support of the state and so on, all of these things were basically taken in to the entity of the state and leveraged against the enemies of the United States during the Second World War, okay? To basically effuse its general political objectives. But since FDR had passed away, right, he died, and then basically, I think it was Truman that had succeeded him, and the various presidents thereafter, the power that was held in him, because he had actually centralized so much positive control over the American state, much in the same way Lincoln had during the American Civil War, that he had completely changed the nature of various agencies, basically put a ton of communists in power, and put a number of them in adjacent quasi-governmental agencies such as the press, the banks, and so on. Now, if we peel back all the propaganda of how we perceive ourselves and objectively look at the United States, you have to understand that we are an oligarchy, like in the best sense. This is a completely value neutral term that I'm using. Like in the Aristotelian sense, there's a monarchy, oligarchy, and the democracy. We live in an oligarchy because within even the state, within the economy, and within the military and so on, there are various different factions. Each are warring with each other, and of course there's also the infusion of foreign factions into the United States that have seeped into our body politic since roughly 1947. Okay? So, the challenge is, how do we get a centralizing figure who will able to cohere the entire state, the entire body politic, into a unity? And moreover, because of the nature of hybrid warfare as it goes into the future, the fact that there is an omnipresent war or a state of war which requires a pervasive and robust holistic response from the state, it would mean that would be constantly in a war footing. I'm not saying rations or something like that, but ultimately we would be stuck in what is called the state of exception, right? National emergency. Because as you probably, if you keep up with the news, and if you are someone who is, has at least two brain cells that can rub together and is skeptical of the state media, you can understand that there are many things that are happening within the United States which indicate deep sabotage missions of foreign agents, lobbying, which is basically legalized corruption of our politicians for the interests of hostile actors. And I'm not even talking about one state or the other. I'm not even going to name any names, but what I'm saying is everyone does it, even our ostensible allies. And then on top of everything else, the economy, for instance, is being swept up by different international interests. So basically, for instance, the PRC has a number of large tracts of land, of arable land, that are under its basically agricultural company umbrella. A lot of the mineral deposits, which are basically the precursor to ammunition and a number of other different weapon systems, are under the control of PRC members or aligned individual businessmen. Okay. So what does this mean? Is that we're basically being subjugated politically through other means than conventional warfare. Because back in the day, there were, basically the final say in international conflicts came down to tank divisions, air armies, infantrymen, and so on, and of course, the FBI and basically the police that will be able to kind of control the domestic situation of any nation. You call this basically internal police. But now, with the advent of gray hybrid warfare, we are constantly in a state of war, and therefore constantly should be measuring our interests under the lens of hostile actors who are both international and domestic. And so, as a part of the natural evolution of the civilization and the actual, let's say, the reaction to the material landscape we inhabit, so technology, internet, for instance, like, there's huge tampering with our, not simply our social media, but with our actual voting processes themselves. Foreign state actors take a very keen interest in all elections, from the federal level all the way down to the municipality. It is massive and pervasive. In the words of Senator Joe McCarthy, it is a conspiracy beyond measure. And if America ever really understood the magnitude of this kind of threat we face, the fact that the Trojan horse is inside the city, and the Greeks have yet to jump out and leap out and open the gates to the enemy, I think people would actually respond to this in a very robust way. But ultimately, the natural progression of regimes, this is another thing that we have to understand. Okay? Aristotle explains the progression of regimes as a constant evolution from monarchy to oligarchy to democracy and then back again. Right now, we are in a kind of system where, yes, we have oligarchies, but the majority of the power of the body politic rests in the demos, right? The people. And it's ever more so increasing in that way, whether it's populism or the communists who are basically for the technocratic elite. They're basically on the defensive, and then the American people are on the offensive. But then again, the populist reaction is in and of itself a demos. And so whenever the populists win, there is elected a Caesar. In ancient times, of course, that was Rome, right? So for instance, the aristocracy, which were an oligarchy of the Republic, were derelict in their statesmanship. They were not looking out for the Roman citizenry. They were importing slave labor, literally, to undercut regular Roman workers. They were soliciting bribes at the expense of the Roman state. They were basically doing many of the self-same things that the current American elite are doing as well. Okay? So, at this point in time, for as much as it may seem on the surface that these terms that we use are the antipode of how we perceive them or how they really are, you have to understand that the future is one, right, for America. Whether it's in 50 years or 100 years, the evolution under these conditions that we're faced will lead to an autocratic government. And that's a certainty. I'll bet you $1,000 right now, Legionaries, that's what's going to happen. Now it's just a matter of timeline, and it's a matter of which persuasion the Caesar is. Will they be of the left or the right? And these terms are not, they are not inconsequential, right? Because they have a content, they have a substance, and it affects, of course, the trajectory of the ideal, right? The idea, the spirit of a nation is modified by these various crystallized forms taking place. One gains ascendancy over the other and sets the path for the next 80 years, which is, the atypical American cycle of effectively Caesarism. Okay? And therefore, Legionaries, I think it's important we just leave it there and we understand what's at stake, right? Not only are we faced with enemies abroad, but we have a multitude of them, of enemies within. Enemies who want to see the dissolution of our great republic. Enemies from without who want to see us subjugated and slaves. Ultimately, the way forward is one which will be very difficult for your average American to acquiesce to. It's going to be a life of discipline, a life where we are dedicated to the whole. So, in other words, just as Plato said, out of a regime of extreme individualism and freedom will come a regime of extreme cohesion, well, dictatorial powers, and, let's say, discipline. I, for one, am very positive about this view because I believe that the American will win out. I believe that if there will be the necessary abridgments to certain liberties that we have grown accustomed to, for instance, the freedom to be pieces of shit, I believe that the ones that are necessary to maintain, which define us, which is freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of effectively excellence, right? Those will be maintained, and the ones that will be sheared away are the very things that we could do without. I believe in America of Starship Troopers. I believe in America that wins. Without further ado, Legionaries, this is Sergeant Barnes, General Lance, Commander's Tent, signing off.